The moving truck pulled away from my property as I watched Sheriff Corinne drive up my driveway one last time. She stepped out of her patrol car, her face red with rage, her hand resting on her weapon. Behind her were 3 squad cars filled with deputies who had terrorized my neighbors for months. "You think you have won," she screamed, pointing her finger at me. "You think buying this land makes you untouchable." I smiled and held up the legal documents that would change everything. "Sheriff Corinne, you are trespassing on my property." My name is David, and for 15 years I lived the dream that so many people chase but never catch. I owned a beautiful ranch in Montana, complete with rolling hills, clear streams, and enough space for my German Shepherd Max to run free without a care in the world. Every morning at sunrise, Max and I would walk the same path we had traveled for over a decade. We would start at the old oak tree near my front porch, follow the fence line that marked my property boundary, and end up at the small pond where Max loved to drink the cool water. The air was clean, the silence was golden, and life felt perfect. My ranch sat on 47 acres of prime land that I had purchased with my life savings after 20 years of working construction in the city. The property was completely fenced, legally surveyed, and mine according to every document filed with the county. I had earned this peace through hard work and sacrifice. My neighbors were good people. The Johnsons ran cattle on the land next to mine. The Martinez family owned a small horse farm down the road. We all respected each other's boundaries and lived in harmony. Crime was nearly non-existent in our area, and the local sheriff's department rarely had reason to patrol our quiet corner of the county. That peaceful existence lasted until the day I met Sheriff Corinne Mitchell. She was a woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to measure everything around her for potential violations. Corinne had been recently transferred to our county from somewhere in Colorado, and she brought with her an attitude that immediately felt wrong for our quiet community. Our first meeting happened on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Max and I were finishing our usual walk when I noticed a patrol car parked at the edge of my property. Sheriff Corinne was standing beside her vehicle, writing something on a clipboard and staring directly at me. "Good morning, officer," I called out as Max and I approached. "Is everything all right?" Corinne looked up from her clipboard with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Just getting familiar with the area," she said. "I am Sheriff Corinne Mitchell. You must be the owner of this property." "That is right," I replied. "David Thompson. I have lived here for 15 years. Welcome to the neighborhood." Corinne nodded slowly, her gaze shifting from me to Max, then to the path we had just walked. "Beautiful property," she said. "Lot of open space. Lot of freedom." Something in the way she said that word made my stomach tighten, but I pushed the feeling aside. "We like it that way out here," I told her. "I am sure you do," Corinne replied, tucking her clipboard under her arm. "Well, Mr. Thompson, I am sure I will be seeing you around." As her patrol car disappeared down the road, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. Max whined softly beside me, as if he had sensed something wrong as well. I should have trusted that instinct. 3 weeks later, Sheriff Corinne returned to my property with a completely different attitude. It was a Thursday morning, and Max and I had just finished our walk when I heard the familiar sound of gravel crunching under tires. I turned to see the same patrol car pulling into my driveway, but this time Corinne stepped out with official paperwork in her hand and a stern expression on her face. "Mr. Thompson," she called out as she approached, "I need to speak with you about a violation that has been reported on your property." I felt my heart rate increase as she walked toward me with the confidence of someone who held all the power in the situation. Max stayed close to my side, sensing the tension in the air. "What kind of violation?" I asked, genuinely confused. Karen consulted her paperwork with theatrical precision. "You have been observed walking your dog off-leash on this property without proper permits and in violation of County Ordinance 47B regarding animal control in unincorporated areas." I stared at her in complete disbelief. "Sheriff, this is my property. I own this land. I have been walking my dog here for 15 years without any problems." "Ownership of land does not exempt you from county ordinances regarding public safety and animal control," Karen replied coldly. "Your dog poses a potential threat to other residents and livestock in the area." The absurdity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. Max was the gentlest dog I had ever known. He had never shown aggression toward any person or animal. More importantly, we were walking on my own property, within my own fence lines, bothering absolutely no one. "Can I see this ordinance you are referring to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. Karen handed me a citation written on official county letterhead. The fine was $350, and the violation was listed as unlawful animal activity in unincorporated area. The description was so vague it could have meant anything. "This is ridiculous," I said, reading through the citation. "I have property deeds, survey maps, and tax records proving this is private property. You cannot cite me for walking my dog on my own land." "Mr. Thompson," Karen said with a condescending tone that made my blood boil, "you can dispute this citation in court if you choose to do so. Until then, I am advising you that continued violations will result in escalating fines and potential impoundment of your animal." The threat to Max cut through me like a knife. "You cannot impound my dog for walking on my own property." "I can and I will if you continue to violate county ordinances," Karen replied, turning back toward her patrol car. "Consider this your official warning." As she drove away, I stood in my driveway holding the citation with shaking hands. Max looked up at me with confused eyes, as if asking what had just happened to our peaceful world. That night, I called the county courthouse to ask about Ordinance 47B. After being transferred 3 times, I finally spoke with a clerk who told me that the ordinance I was cited under had been repealed 2 years earlier. When I asked about animal control laws for private property, she confirmed what I already knew. Property owners have the right to allow their pets to roam freely on their own land, as long as the animals do not leave the property or pose a danger to others. I went to bed that night with a sick feeling in my stomach. This was not about animal control or public safety. This was about power, control, and harassment. Sheriff Karen had decided to target me for reasons I could not understand, and she was using her badge to make my life miserable. I had no idea that this was only the beginning. Over the next 2 months, Sheriff Karen turned my peaceful ranch into a daily nightmare. She began patrolling my property every single day, sometimes multiple times per day, looking for any excuse to write another citation. The second citation came just 1 week after the first. This time, Karen claimed that my fence was in violation of county height restrictions, even though the same fence had been approved and inspected when I built it 15 years earlier. The fine was $400. The third citation was for improper waste disposal, because I had a compost pile behind my barn where I disposed of organic waste from my garden. Karen claimed it posed a health hazard to the community, despite the fact that my nearest neighbor lived over a mile away. Another $400. By the fourth citation, I realized that Karen was not working alone. She began bringing deputies with her, turning each visit into an intimidating display of official power. These young officers looked uncomfortable with the harassment campaign, but they followed orders without question. "Mr. Thompson," Karen announced during one particularly humiliating visit, "I am citing you for operating an unlicensed agricultural facility." "This is a private residence with a small garden," I protested. "I am not operating any kind of business." "You have livestock feed stored on your property without proper permits," she replied, pointing to the bag of dog food I kept in my garage. The absurdity had reached a point where I could no longer control my anger. "That is dog food, Sheriff. It is for my dog. The ordinance does not distinguish between types of animal feed," Karen said, with a smirk that told me she was enjoying every moment of my frustration. That afternoon, I drove to the county sheriff's office to file a formal complaint. I spoke with Captain Rodriguez, who listened to my story with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Mr. Thompson," he said after I finished explaining the situation, "Sheriff Mitchell is new to our department, but she has an excellent record from her previous position. Are you certain these citations are not legitimate?" I placed copies of all the citations on his desk, along with documentation proving that most of the ordinances Karen had cited either did not exist or did not apply to private property. Captain Rodriguez studied the paperwork for several minutes before looking up at me with an uncomfortable expression. "I will speak with Sheriff Mitchell about this matter," he said finally. "In the meantime, I suggest you consult with an attorney if you believe these citations are invalid." 2 days later, Karen appeared at my property with 3 patrol cars and 5 deputies. She was holding a clipboard and wearing the same cold smile I had grown to despise. "Mr. Thompson," she announced loudly enough for all the deputies to hear, "I am here to conduct a comprehensive inspection of your property for code violations and public safety hazards." For the next 3 hours, Karen and her team walked every inch of my land, measuring fence posts, photographing my compost pile, and taking notes about everything they could find. Max stayed close to me throughout the inspection, whining softly whenever Karen came near. The inspection resulted in 6 additional citations totaling over $2,000 in fines. The violations included everything from improper signage, because I did not have a street number visible from the road, to environmental hazards, because I had a small burn pile where I disposed of brush and tree branches. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun set over my property, Karen's patrol car appeared at the end of my driveway. She did not get out of the vehicle. She just sat there for 20 minutes, watching my house, making sure I knew she was watching. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. I had spent my entire adult life working to afford this piece of paradise, and now a corrupt sheriff was using her badge to drive me away from everything I had built. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday morning when Karen arrived with an animal control officer and a court order. She claimed that Max posed a danger to the community and needed to be impounded pending a hearing. "You cannot take my dog," I said, stepping between Max and the animal control officer. "The court has determined that your animal represents a public safety risk," Karen replied, holding up the official paperwork. "You can retrieve him after you pay all outstanding fines and agree to keep him properly restrained." I looked down at Max, who was trembling beside me, and realized that Karen had finally found the one threat that would destroy me completely. She was going to take away the only companion I had left in the world. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I could not sleep after Karen threatened to impound Max. I spent the entire night packing around my house, trying to figure out how to fight back against someone who had the entire legal system on her side. By morning, I had made a decision that would consume the next several months of my life. I was going to investigate Sheriff Corinne Mitchell and find out exactly who she was and why she had chosen to target me. I started by hearing a private investigator named Janet Walsh, a former police detective who specialized in cases involving official misconduct. Janet was a small woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded me of my grandmother. "David," she said during our first meeting, "what you are describing sounds like a classic abuse of power case. But if we are going to build a case against a sheriff, we need to do this right. One mistake and she will destroy you." Janet began her investigation by researching Corinne's background and employment history. What she found was disturbing and enlightening. Sheriff Corinne Mitchell had been forced to resign from her previous position in Colorado following allegations of harassment and misconduct. Multiple citizens had filed complaints claiming that Corinne had targeted them with frivolous citations and intimidation tactics. The department had quietly allowed her to resign rather than face a formal investigation. "She has done this before," Janet told me during our second meeting. "Corinne Mitchell has a pattern of targeting property owners in rural areas. My guess is that she chooses people who are isolated and unlikely to have political connections." But the most shocking discovery came when Janet obtained Corinne's financial records through a contact in the banking industry. Corinne was deeply in debt, owing over $80,000 in credit card debt and facing foreclosure on her home. "David, I think I know why she is targeting you and others like you," Janet said, spreading the financial documents across the table. "The county gets to keep a percentage of all citation revenue. Corinne is generating money for the department and probably getting bonuses based on her citation numbers." The corruption was even deeper than I had imagined. Corinne was not just abusing her power for psychological satisfaction. She was literally profiting from the harassment campaign against me and other property owners. Janet's investigation revealed that I was not Corinne's only victim. Over the past year, she had written over 400 citations to property owners throughout the county. Most people had simply paid the fines rather than fight the system, but a few had tried to contest the citations in court. "The judges are dismissing most of these cases," Janet explained. "But by the time people get their day in court, they have already spent more money on legal fees than the original citation was worth. It is a perfect scam." The final piece of the puzzle came when Janet discovered something that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. The land where Corinne lived, along with most of her neighborhood, was part of a large tract that had been purchased by a development company several years earlier. The company had gone bankrupt before building the planned subdivision, and the property was now available for purchase at a fraction of its original value. "David," Janet said with a smile that told me she had found something important, "what would you say if I told you that you could buy the land where Sheriff Corinne Mitchell lives?" I stared at the property records Janet had placed in front of me. The tract included not only Corinne's neighborhood, but also the building where the sheriff's department had their satellite office. "How much would it cost?" I asked, my heart racing as I began to understand the possibilities. "Less than you have already paid in fines and legal fees," Janet replied. "And once you own the land, you can decide who is allowed to live there." For the first time in months, I felt hope instead of despair. Corinne had made the mistake of targeting someone who had the resources and determination to fight back. Now it was time to turn her own tactics against her. The next phase of my plan required absolute secrecy and perfect timing. I could not afford to make any mistakes because Corinne would use her law enforcement connections to interfere with my efforts if she discovered what I was planning. I started by assembling a team of professionals who could help me execute the most satisfying revenge in legal history. In addition to Janet Walsh, my private investigator, I hired Marcus Chen, a real estate attorney who specialized in complex property transactions, and Sarah Williams, a former prosecutor who now worked in civil litigation. David, Marcus said during our first strategy meeting, what you are proposing is completely legal, but it is also incredibly complex. We need to make sure every document is perfect and every step follows proper legal procedures. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would purchase the entire tract of land where Corinne lived, which would make me her landlord. Since most of the residents were renting their homes rather than owning them, I would have the legal right to decide who could live on my property. But the plan went deeper than simple eviction. Sarah Williams had researched the legal framework for property use restrictions and discovered that I could implement comprehensive rules about who was allowed on my land and under what circumstances. You will essentially have the same power over your tenants that Corinne has been exercising over you, Sarah explained. The difference is that your power will be based on legitimate property ownership rather than abuse of official authority. The financial aspects of the plan required careful coordination. I needed to liquidate some of my retirement investments and obtain a commercial loan to cover the purchase price of approximately $2.4 million. The monthly rental income from the existing tenants would cover most of the loan payments, making the investment financially viable. Marcus spent 2 weeks conducting due diligence on the property, making sure there were no hidden legal issues that could complicate the purchase. He discovered that the bankrupt development company had left several liens on the property, but these could be resolved as part of the purchase process. The seller is motivated, Marcus reported. They want to get this property off their books as quickly as possible. If we can close within 30 days, they will accept our offer. While Marcus handled the real estate aspects of the plan, Janet continued investigating Corinne's activities. Her surveillance revealed that Corinne was living in a rental house on the property I was planning to purchase, and that several of her closest supporters in the sheriff's department also lived in the same neighborhood. David, this is even better than we thought, Janet said, showing me photographs of Corinne's house and the surrounding area. If you buy this land, you will control the housing situation for Corinne and at least 4 deputies who have been helping her harass property owners throughout the county. Sarah Williams worked on developing the legal framework for the property use restrictions I would implement after the purchase. The rules would be based on legitimate safety and community standards, but they would be enforced with the same rigid inflexibility that Corinne had used against me. We can require background checks for all residents, Sarah explained. We can ban people who have been involved in harassment or abuse of authority. We can require professional references and community service records. All of these requirements are legal for private property owners. The timeline for the plan required precise coordination. The property purchase would close on a Friday afternoon, giving me weekend time to prepare the legal notices that would be served on Monday morning. Corinne and her supporters would have no warning and no time to prepare a response. The element of surprise is crucial, Marcus emphasized. Once Corinne realizes what is happening, she will try to use her law enforcement connections to interfere with the process. We need to make sure all the legal paperwork is filed and all the notices are served before she has a chance to react. I spent several sleepless nights reviewing every aspect of the plan, looking for potential problems or legal challenges. The revenge I was planning was more complex and expensive than anything I had ever attempted, but it was also completely legal and perfectly justified. Karen had taught me that power could be used to make people's lives miserable through rigid enforcement of rules and regulations. Now I was going to use that same lesson against her, but with one crucial difference. My power would be based on legitimate property ownership rather than corrupt abuse of official authority. 3 weeks before the scheduled closing date, I received one final citation from Karen. This time, she claimed that Max had been observed behaving aggressively toward a mail carrier, even though our mailbox was located at the road, over a quarter-mile from where Max spent his time. As I read the citation, I smiled for the first time in months. Karen had no idea that her reign of terror was about to end, and that she was about to learn what it felt like to be powerless against someone who controlled her living situation. The closing was scheduled for Friday, October 13th. I could not have chosen a more appropriate date. Friday, October 13th arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. I woke up before dawn, too excited and nervous to sleep any longer. After months of planning and preparation, the day had finally come to execute the most expensive and satisfying revenge in my life. The closing was scheduled for 2 o'clock at the office of Hartwell and Associates, the law firm representing the seller. I arrived 30 minutes early, carrying a briefcase filled with all the documentation we had prepared for the post-purchase phase of the plan. Marcus Chen was already waiting in the conference room when I arrived, along with Sarah Williams and Janet Walsh. The four of us had become a tight team over the past several months, united by our determination to stop Karen's abuse of power. "David," Marcus said as I took my seat at the large oak table, "are you ready to become the owner of 43 residential properties and one commercial building?" I nodded, though my hands were shaking slightly as I signed the first set of documents. The financial commitment was enormous, but the potential satisfaction was even greater. The seller's representatives arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, eager to complete a transaction that would remove a problematic asset from their portfolio. The actual closing process took less than an hour, but those 60 minutes felt like the longest of my life. When the final signature was completed and the keys were placed in my hand, I felt a surge of power unlike anything I had ever experienced. I now owned the land where Sheriff Karen Mitchell lived, along with the homes of several deputies who had participated in her harassment campaign. "Congratulations, Mr. Thompson," the seller's attorney said as we shook hands. "You are now the proud owner of Pinehurst Commons." As soon as the closing was finished, Sarah Williams and I drove directly to the county courthouse to file the property ownership transfer and the new community rules that would govern life at Pinehurst Commons. These rules had been carefully crafted to exclude anyone who had been involved in official misconduct or abuse of authority. The weekend passed slowly as I prepared for Monday morning, when the real drama would begin. Janet Walsh had arranged for a professional process server to deliver legal notices to all the tenants, informing them of the change in ownership and the new community standards. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, which seemed appropriate for what was about to unfold. At 8 o'clock sharp, the process server began delivering notices to each residence in Pinehurst Commons. I waited at home, knowing that my phone would start ringing soon. The first call came at 8:27. "David Thompson," the voice was shaking with rage. "This is Sheriff Karen Mitchell. What the hell do you think you are doing?" "Good morning, Sheriff," I replied calmly. I assume you received the notice about the change in property ownership. You cannot do this, Karen screamed into the phone. You cannot buy property just to harass law enforcement officers. Actually, Sheriff, I can, I said, enjoying every word. Property ownership is a fundamental right in this country. I have the same authority over my tenants that you have been exercising over citizens in this county. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Corinne spoke again, her voice now cold and controlled. This is not over, Thompson. I will find a way to stop you. I am sure you will try, I replied. But I suggest you focus on finding a new place to live. According to the notice you received, you have 30 days to vacate the premises. Corinne hung up without another word, but I knew this was just the beginning of her response. Within an hour, my phone was ringing constantly as other tenants called to complain about the new ownership and community rules. By noon, 3 patrol cars were parked outside my ranch. Corinne and several deputies were standing beside their vehicles, clearly planning some kind of official response to my property purchase. Mr. Thompson, Corinne called out as I walked onto my front porch, I need to speak with you about a matter of official business. Sheriff Mitchell, I replied with a smile, unless you have a warrant, you are trespassing on my property. And unless this involves an emergency, I suggest you make an appointment through my attorney. The expression on Corinne's face was worth every dollar I had spent on the property purchase. For the first time since I had met her, she was the one who was powerless and frustrated. This is harassment, she said, her voice shaking with anger. No, Sheriff, I replied, this is justice. The implementation of the comprehensive neighborhood ban was more dramatic and satisfying than I had ever imagined. Over the next 2 weeks, the power dynamics that had controlled my life for months were completely reversed, with Corinne and her supporters experiencing the same helpless frustration they had inflicted on me. The new community rules at Pinehurst Commons were extensive and strictly enforced. All residents were required to submit to background checks that included reviews of their professional conduct and community standing. Anyone who had been involved in official misconduct, harassment, or abuse of authority was prohibited from living on the property. Corinne was the first to be officially banned, but she was not the only one. Deputy Martinez, who had participated in the intimidating property inspections at my ranch, received his eviction notice on Tuesday. Deputy Johnson, who had helped Corinne write frivolous citations, was banned on Wednesday. By the end of the week, 4 law enforcement officers had been ordered to leave Pinehurst Commons. The community reaction was swift and divided. Some residents supported the changes, having grown tired of living in a neighborhood dominated by corrupt law enforcement officers. Others were angry about the disruption and tried to organize resistance against the new ownership. Mr. Thompson, called Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down from Corinne, you cannot just throw people out of their homes because you do not like their jobs. Mrs. Patterson, I replied during a tense community meeting held in the neighborhood clubhouse, I am not discriminating against law enforcement officers. I am prohibiting people who have abused their authority and harassed innocent citizens. There is a significant difference. The meeting was attended by about 30 residents, with Corinne sitting in the front row wearing her uniform and glaring at me throughout my presentation. Several deputies sat beside her, creating an intimidating presence that reminded everyone of the power they still held during working hours. You think you are clever, Corinne said when I finished explaining the new community standards, but you cannot hide behind property ownership forever. I know who you are and what you have done." "Sheriff Mitchell," I replied calmly, "I have done nothing except exercise my legal rights as a property owner. The same rights you have been violating for months while harassing citizens throughout this county." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Some residents were nodding in agreement with my position, while others looked uncomfortable with the confrontation between their new landlord and the local sheriff. After the meeting, I discovered that Karen had not given up her campaign against me despite her own housing crisis. She had begun contacting my former tenants at Pinehurst Commons, trying to convince them to file complaints against me with various county agencies. But Karen's influence was not as strong as she had believed. Many residents had grown tired of her authoritarian attitude and were actually relieved to see her power challenged. Mrs. Chen, who lived next door to Karen, stopped by my ranch to thank me personally. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "you have no idea how refreshing it is to see someone stand up to Sheriff Mitchell. She has been terrorizing this neighborhood for months, telling us what we can plant in our gardens and how we can park our cars." The most satisfying moment came when Karen's closest supporter, Deputy Williams, received his eviction notice. Williams had been the most aggressive participant in the harassment campaign against me, and he had made several threatening comments about what would happen if I continued to resist Karen's authority. "You cannot do this to me," Williams said when he called to complain about his eviction. "I have been a law enforcement officer for 12 years. I have rights." "Deputy Williams," I replied, "you had rights until you chose to participate in an illegal harassment campaign against innocent citizens. Actions have consequences, even for law enforcement officers." The breaking point came when Karen attempted to use her official authority to interfere with the eviction process. She appeared at Pinehurst Commons with a court order claiming that the evictions violated tenant rights laws and demanding that I reinstate all the banned residents. "Mr. Thompson," she announced in front of gathered residents and local news reporters who had begun covering the story, "you are in violation of county housing ordinances and federal tenant protection laws." I had been prepared for this moment. Sarah Williams stepped forward with a briefcase full of legal documents that demolished every aspect of Karen's court order. "Sheriff Mitchell," Sarah said with professional authority, "the court order you are holding is based on false information and misrepresentation of applicable laws. Private property owners have broad authority to establish community standards and exclude tenants who violate those standards." The look of defeat on Karen's face was worth every sleepless night and every dollar I had spent on the revenge campaign. She had finally encountered a situation where her badge and uniform could not intimidate someone into submission. By the end of the month, Karen and 3 deputies had been forced to find housing outside of Pinehurst Commons. The neighborhood was quieter and more peaceful than it had been in years, with new residents who appreciated living in a community where bullying and harassment were not tolerated. But the story was not over yet. The final chapter of my battle with Sheriff Karen Mitchell unfolded over the following 6 months, bringing a resolution that was more satisfying and far-reaching than I had ever expected when the harassment began. Karen's eviction from Pinehurst Commons marked the beginning of a dramatic downfall that extended far beyond her housing situation. The publicity surrounding our conflict had attracted the attention of investigative journalists and civil rights attorneys who began examining Karen's entire record as a law enforcement officer. The county district attorney launched a formal investigation into Karen's citation practices after receiving complaints from over 40 property owners who had been targeted with frivolous violations. The investigation revealed that Karen had generated over $200,000 in citation revenue during her first year in the county, an amount that was 10 times higher than any previous sheriff in the department's history. Mr. Thompson, District Attorney Roberts told me during a meeting at his office, your case opened the door to exposing a systematic abuse of power that was affecting dozens of families throughout the county. Sheriff Mitchell was essentially running an extortion racket using her badge as cover. The investigation also revealed that Karen had been falsifying reports and lying about the basis for many of her citations. The dangerous dog report she had filed about Max, for example, was completely fabricated. She had never received any complaints about Max from mail carriers or neighbors. Captain Rodriguez, who had initially dismissed my complaints about Karen's behavior, issued a public apology and announced new oversight procedures to prevent similar abuses in the future. We failed Mr. Thompson and other citizens who were victimized by Sheriff Mitchell's misconduct, Rodriguez said during a press conference. This department is committed to rebuilding trust with the community and ensuring that law enforcement authority is never again used to harass innocent people. Karen's response to the investigation was to file a lawsuit against me, claiming that my purchase of Pinehurst Commons was part of a conspiracy to interfere with law enforcement operations. The lawsuit was dismissed within 3 months, with the judge ruling that property ownership rights cannot be restricted simply because the owner chooses to exclude people who have abused their authority. The most satisfying development came when the State Attorney General's office opened its own investigation into Karen's previous employment history. The investigation revealed that Karen had been forced to resign from 2 previous law enforcement positions due to similar misconduct allegations. She has been doing this for years, Janet Walsh told me as we reviewed the investigative reports. Karen Mitchell is a serial abuser who has been moving from one jurisdiction to another, leaving a trail of harassment victims wherever she goes. In March, Karen was formally terminated from the sheriff's department and charged with official misconduct, extortion, and filing false reports. She eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 2 years of probation and community service. The civil lawsuit that I filed against Karen and the county resulted in a settlement that covered all of my legal expenses and provided compensation for the months of harassment I had endured. More importantly, the county agreed to implement new training and oversight procedures to prevent similar abuses in the future. The transformation of Pinehurst Commons into a peaceful, harassment-free community became a source of pride that extended far beyond my personal satisfaction. New residents moved in who appreciated living in a place where bullying and intimidation were not tolerated. Property values increased as the neighborhood developed a reputation for safety and community cooperation. But the most meaningful resolution came in my relationship with Max and the restoration of our peaceful morning walks. For the first time in over a year, we could follow our familiar path around the ranch without fear of harassment or intimidation. As I reflect on the entire experience, I realize that Karen Mitchell taught me valuable lessons about power, justice, and the importance of fighting back against abuse of authority. She showed me that corrupt officials rely on their victims being too intimidated or too isolated to resist effectively. My revenge against Karen was not just about personal satisfaction, though that element was certainly present. It was about proving that ordinary citizens have the power to hold corrupt officials accountable when they are willing to invest the time, money, and effort required to fight back intelligently. The property at Pinehurst Commons remains a profitable investment and a symbol of what can be accomplished when victims of abuse refuse to accept injustice quietly. Corinne Mitchell learned that power can be turned against those who abuse it, and that sometimes the people you choose to target have the resources and determination to fight back. Today, Max and I continue our morning walks in peace, knowing that we have earned the right to enjoy our property without fear of harassment. The sunrise still looks beautiful over the Montana hills, but it looks even better when you know that you have successfully defended your right to enjoy it. Justice, I discovered, tastes even sweeter when it is served with patience, planning, and perfect legal execution.